Welcome once again to my Education Reform Independent Study Lecture Series. I'm going to start today. Today is going to be the lecture on the history of education reform, the first part of that lecture. But I'm going to start today on a clarification from the last video. There was something that I decided when I looked at it again that needed some clarification. So what I'm clarifying here is the State Departments and State Boards of Education slide. So last time what we got through was this. The Governor's Cabinet includes the State Department of Education, which has several offices, each with specialized responsibilities, which is controlled and advised by the State Board of Education, which appoints the Commissioner of Education, or the Chief Officer in the state, whatever they call it, who is head honcho in the State Department of Education. And this is where we stopped with this much of a cyclical nature. But I wanted to add, just to clarify the relationship between these bodies and the state legislator, here's where that gets added. So the State Board of Education advises. Remember, the State Board of Education is the real example of representatives in this republic who are listening to the constituents. They are taking all the information that the State Department of Education has gathered and looking at it, and then they advise the state legislator on possible reforms and ideas for bills that need to be implemented. The state legislature is the body that actually has the control to create those laws and new reforms which actually govern the schools, which in turn, again, in the cyclical nature of this whole system, those laws and reforms are implemented, monitored, and regulated by the State Department of Education. Remember, the State Department is the one that we saw has the leadership role, the regulatory role, the oversight role, all of these different roles, because all of its offices control all the information flow about the bills and whether they're working and what's going on in schools, and then the State Board of Education oversees all of that and decides how to advise the state legislature. So I wanted to add that relationship into there, just clarify what I said last time. And now we'll actually get into the lecture. So again, Education Reform 101, Winter 2014, University of Denver, with me, Desiree Seidel, and Kimberly Hartnett-Edwards. And today's lecture is the History of Education Reform Part 1. I'm starting at just about the foundation of our country, 1776, and going to about 1899, just because I've divided the years from 1776 to 2000 in approximately even groups. And I'm going to go decade by decade. Today, a lot of what you're going to see, my goal is to make this lecture visually interesting and engaging by including not only the events that have to do with education reform, but also adding in basic historical context for the U.S. at the time. So I've got all the presidents in here. I've got some information about inventions that were invented around these times, so that you have sort of a basic understanding of where we are in history. And then I'm also talking about all of the events that went on in terms of education and education reform. And I'm also going to stop occasionally to focus on trends or the mindset of particular decades in education reform, which for me is because my final paper my midterm paper has to focus on the trends that I've seen so far. So that's sort of part of why I'm doing that, is to sort of understand the bigger picture. So we'll get into it. We're going to start a little bit before the United States was formed. Oh, and just to let you guys know, these here, I don't know if you saw them already, but these are a lot of the books that I've been using for this lecture. And I really want to recommend this book. I'm going to come a little closer so you can see it. The Education Reform Library in a Book by Ian C. Friedman. It's been so helpful for me, and most of the information that you see today came from this book. And he starts with these dates before the U.S. was formed. So there's just a couple things. One, in 360 BC, Plato writes The Republic, which expresses, among other things, the benefits of state support of an educational system. In the 1st century AD, the Roman educator Quintilian expresses the importance and benefits of a broad public education system. In the late 13th century, the Dominican monk, philosopher, and scholar Thomas Aquinas, I can never say his name right, establishes the foundation of the Roman Catholic education, and then later in 1511 and 1516, the Dutch humanist Desiderius Erasmus writes two things, one upon the method of right instruction, and the other one of the first liberal education of children. The first one, sorry, I keep doing that. The first one talking about the best way to educate teachers, and the second one talking about a more liberal, inclusive form of education. And then we get into a couple things that are in colonial America. In 1635, the Boston Latin School becomes the first public secondary school in the British colony of North America, and it becomes a model for other schools later. In 1642, Massachusetts colony passes a law that requires the selectmen, basically the governing officers in the colony, to determine that parents and masters of apprentices are providing for the education of children. It also stated that if they did not, the government was allowed to take the children out of that situation and place them in one where they would be educated. In 1647, another Massachusetts law is passed that this time orders that any township with more than 100 families has to have a grammar school. And then in 1683, in Pennsylvania, we get a law that says that all children should be instructed in reading, writing, and a useful trade. However, in the colonies, formal education at this point is still very denominational and private, mostly because of how diverse it was religiously, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then also in 1690, we get the first New England Primer, which is basically the first English textbook. And it's an English language guide that also includes biblical content, and it's published and, like I said, basically becomes the main tool for pre-revolutionary period. So here's some stuff on the first New England Primer, just a couple pictures of it. That's just the cover there, and then over here it's got some examples of the rhymes that they would use to teach kids English, and a lot of it is biblical. You'll see in Adam's fall, we sinned all, and then over here, John feels the rod and blesses God. And then this one over here is for the alphabet. You can see the letters O, P, Q, R, S, and we've got like Peter denies his Lord and cries, Rachel doth mourn for her firstborn. So a lot of biblical content in this one, but it was one of the first books that was used before the Revolution to teach English. And then we've got, this is all the stuff that you already saw, and then we're adding in 1762, the French philosopher, French name, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I don't know, writes the novel Emily, which provides a description of the benefits of child-centered education, which we're going to see a lot later when we get to the 1900s and the progressive movement. But a good definition of it here, it says it's a pedagogical approach designed with the child's interests and needs at the center of the learning process, with an emphasis on experiential and problem-solving activities. And then again, it says, like I did, that it becomes popular in the progressive movement. Okay, so a good summary here. Before the nation started, the colonial school, what did it look like? This is, by the way, the Boston Latin School that I mentioned, the first colonial school. This picture is obviously taken a lot later because there's cars in it, but anyway. So the colonial school is characterized by low government influence due to the extensive religious diversity in the local colonies, so the government pretty much stayed out of it. In the South, religion was really important, and it was devoutly practiced, but it was not the dominating factor in life. So everyone didn't need to know how to read the Bible. That wasn't the goal of education, and they decided that parents could mostly provide for their own children. So a lot of education at the time in the South was purely based on social class. You really only got educated if you were wealthy, and wealthy students were sent to something called a tutorial school, which was essentially a private institution in which a tutor would instruct young people. And then there were also dame schools, which were actually throughout the colonies, but they're mentioned in the southern section of the book. And they were schools in which a woman would provide rudimentary instruction in her own home, often even while she was taking care of her own home and her own children. So really informal, really local-based, not well-controlled, not well-regulated. And then in the middle colonies, we got a couple different alternatives. We had the Quaker schools, which were the most inclusive schools in the colonial period. They often included education for girls and for children, and even some of them included education for blacks. So the Quakers were obviously some of the most inclusive people at the time. And then we have in 1751 Benjamin Franklin's Academy, which is similar. It emphasized practical education. So, training for merchandising, navigation, trade, and mechanics. So you could be successful in a job. And then in New England, which we'll see really set the foundation for what the rest of the schools and the rest of the country later became. So they were based initially on the Puritan philosophy, which had to do with really just keeping kids educated in order to avoid idleness and giving them instruction to avert evil. So it was really about the hardworking Puritan ideal of not being idle. And then we have the higher level of economic activity in New England. So they were focusing more on shipbuilding, manufacturing, and trade, which required people to be able to read and think. So that was the real necessity for education there. And then in 1635, we have the Boston Latin School that we already talked about, which was the first public school. But that was an English institution. I mean, it was purely colonial. And then finally, we just have a general statement that the New England schools were forming traditions. They started ideas like the public support for district schools, the Boston Latin School being publicly supported, local autonomy, so government control being on a local level, compulsory education, which we'll see actually later with the Massachusetts law that we're going to see probably on the next slide or the one after that, and then district education level. So they were really the forerunners of modern public education. And then I have here the general statement. Again, like I said, I was going to do a trend of the mindset of education reform at this time. So it says, if education was considered in any kind of general sense, it was largely diversified by the economic, religious, and social values of each specific area. When it was supported, it was used for achieving the bare minimum religious, social, and professional skills viewed by the various segments of society to be important. However, New England was beginning to lay the foundations of many political traditions that we see in schools and school governments today. So here's a really good general statement about what's going on in the colonial era in education and education reform. Really not much, basically the bare minimum. So now we're going to move into the decades. And I am going to go decade by decade. You'll see a couple decades that don't have anything in them for education reform, but I still included them just to be consistent. So in the 1770s, obviously it's a really big decade for our country, and we should all remember that. So for some historical context, from 1774 to 1789, the Continental Congress is the government, and they served over the American colonies and then later the United States. And then from 1775 to 1783, we have the Revolutionary War. In 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence. Now, in terms of education reform, a lot of British colonial schools were closed or abandoned during the Revolutionary War, which makes sense. And then in 1779, we had a bill from Thomas Jefferson called the Bill for More Diffusion of the More General Diffusion of Knowledge, which actually proposed an idea that was really ahead of his time. He was proposing tax-supported education for 3 years to all white children. But this idea was defeated, and I would argue that really it's because at this time, right in the middle of the Revolutionary War, they're not really interested in providing for education. They don't have the time or the money, and again, this is still, even though they're trying to get out of the colonial governance, they are still in the colonial mindset where they have their differences in each colony and they have different goals everywhere. So this idea of providing education to all communities of children was really out of the question for them at the time. In the 1780s, for context, we get a bunch of states in 1787, Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. In the same year, the Constitution is signed, and remember that we do not mention education at all in the Constitution. And then in 1788, we get a bunch of states. This is really, with the ratification of the Constitution, all of these colonies become states. So these are, most of these, except for Rhode Island, which is later, are the first 13 original states. So we also have Connecticut, Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, South Carolina, Virginia, and then also South Carolina 1 year later. From 1789 to 1797, George Washington is our president. And then we get the first, or I guess the second after the New England Primer, second spelling or English instruction book, which is written by Noah Webster in 1783. It's called the Elementary Spelling Book. It's also referred to as the Blueback Speller. And it includes distinctively American spelling, grammar, and content. So Noah Webster, we'll see this later too, was really big on American nationalism right after the Revolution and was really trying to publish an American English. So this is where that got started. And then here we have July 13, 1787, the Northwest Ordinance, which was a congressional act, is adopted, and it proclaims religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. And what they were talking about was in newly acquired territories. So as the colonies, or as the states started to expand and add more states to the Union, they were declaring that it was important to them to support education in the new territories. And then we have 1790s. We get a bunch of states again. We've got Rhode Island again, one of the first 13. We have Vermont and Kentucky 2 years later. And then in 1794, we get the cotton gin, so we've all learned about how much that revolutionized the South's economy and supported the slave trade because it gave them access to the cotton industry. We also get Tennessee in 1796. John Adams is president from 97 to 1801. Some of these are pretty funny looking pictures of our president. So nothing really in 1790s for education reform, not a big year there. But here we have, again, summary. So the revolutionary and pre-revolutionary school. So a lot of it was influenced by the ideas of the revolution. So we have John Locke up there in the corner. He was a big philosopher during the revolution. And some of his ideas, for example, are that ideas come from experience and that the measure of truth of an idea is its correspondence with concrete, objective, common-sense reality. So these beliefs helped lead to the growth of the kind of practical education programs which were supported by Benjamin Franklin. So, like the practical education schools that we talked about earlier. During the Revolution, obviously it interrupted the movement of education and education reform. But it eventually served with American nationalism to create a distinctively American education form. So we have, again, like I mentioned earlier, Noah Webster. So we already talked about the Elementary Spelling Book, and we also have the Compendious Dictionary. Both of these sort of ratified this idea of an English that was distinctively American, and the Elementary Spelling Book also included sort of subversive notes about ideas that were distinctively American, like liberty and hard work and morality. And Noah Webster also supported free schools as a politician, or as a, political citizen. And then we also have Thomas Jefferson, who we've already mentioned, but he was also a big supporter at this time. So we talked already about the bill for a more general diffusion of knowledge. There are a couple things I wanted to add about it. One, it called for a state system of free elementary schools with local control of secondary schools supported by tuition and scholarships to help pave the way for poor boys. So again, this is way ahead of his time. Not only is he talking about free education at an elementary level, but he's also talking about scholarships from the state that would provide education to secondary schools. The bill did not pass, like we already said, but it provided framework for future school systems. For example, it talked about decentralized control and localization of financial responsibility, which, like I said, was the state distribution of scholarships. And then also we have here, it reduced the stigma of poverty and helped establish an American perception of educational equity, which, again, these are revolutionary ideas that hadn't really been applied yet. And they don't really get recognized until later. We already talked about the Constitution. Again, it had no mention of education. There was the First Amendment, which spawned debate sort of at that time, but mostly later, about church-state separation. At that time, the government didn't technically support religious schools, but like we've already seen from the New England Primer, there were religious ideas embedded in textbooks and teachings and curricula that were used in all kinds of schools, whether or not they were state funded. And then later we also have the Northwest Ordinance, which we mentioned. It was affecting the newly added regions, and it demonstrated that the federal government supported spreading education through the Republic. And what it said was that there had to be a reserved section in each new township for schools, and that would always be supported. And then we also have the Pennsylvania Constitution, which is an example of a state following suit of the Northwest Ordinance, even though Pennsylvania had already been established. But it was, it included a rule that teachers would be paid by the state. It also established funding for the creation of schools, and then after the Pennsylvania Constitution, most states followed suit when they wrote their own constitutions. And then we have again another general statement about this period, the revolutionary and post-revolutionary schools. So a lot of this is a quote again from that library book. Formal education was not yet widespread, but the character and foundation of U.S. public education was established and ready to expand. The emphasis had begun to change from basic education necessitated by regional, religious, social, and economic needs to more liberal, more accessible, and more widespread education that was rooted in American ideals and was supported and controlled by states. So we're moving, like it says, from that bare minimum education that's just really based on religion and social and economic ideas to education like supported by Thomas Jefferson and Noah Webster that's more widespread, more liberal, more accessible, and distinctly American. So now we move to the 1800s, first turn of the century. Thomas Jefferson is president from 1801 to 1809. However, during his presidency, he really didn't act much in education. Most of his educational influence was outside of his presidency. 1803, Ohio becomes a state. 1807, we get the first successful commercial steamboat by Robert Fulton. James Madison is president from 1809 to 1817. And that's it until later. Nothing in education at that time. In 1812, Louisiana becomes a state. Joseph Niepce achieves the first photographic image with the camera obscura. We get Indiana and Mississippi. James Monroe is president from 1817 to 25. We get Illinois and Alabama. And then finally, in events and education reform, in 1812, New York becomes the first state to appoint a superintendent of schools. And just to remind everyone, this is a slide from the original presentation about the superintendents of schools. So in this case, in New York, it's a state superintendent, which is not really what they are now. Remember, right now, the superintendent of schools is at the district level. He's appointed by a district board, and most of his authority is in the district level, setting boundaries, additional facilities, distributing the budget, things like that. So it's a little different. The first superintendent in New York probably had a different role, and I'm imagining at that time, because the population is small enough and the districts aren't really set, that his role can extend to the whole state. But that was the first time it happened. And then we had the 1820s. George Stephenson built the first steam-powered public railway line, so that's a really big invention in our history, moving towards western expansion eventually. In 1820 and 1821, we get Maine and Missouri. John Quincy Adams was president from 25 to 29, and then Andrew Jackson from 29 to 37. In education, we have in 1821 the Boston English Classical School, or later named the Boston English High School, is the nation's first high school. So the Latin school that we saw earlier was a secondary school, but it was a colonial British school. So now this one is the first high school created in the country once it's a nation. And then we have in 1828, Catherine Beecher founds the Hartford Female Seminary, which is a school that really started the process of training for teachers, specifically women. So she says here, not literally, but my leadership was key in providing support for the role of women as teachers in U.S. schools. And then in the 1830s, we've got Arkansas becomes a state, Michigan becomes a state, Martin Van Buren is president from 37 to 41, and then we get Louis first daguerreotype, which is another advancement in photography. In education, in 1837, the Massachusetts legislator Horace Mann, who is a huge deal in education reform, we're going to talk about him a lot, he becomes the first secretary for the nation's first state board of education, significantly contributing to the increased support for public education. That's Horace Mann up there in the top. And we're going to go into, again, we'll review the State Board of Education, and we'll talk more about Horace Mann, like I said. Before I move on, we also have Buffalo, New York, becomes the first major city to appoint a local superintendent whose major duty is to develop a uniform course of study. So we already talked about when New York State got the first superintendent, which was different than what we see as a superintendent before, but now the same state has a city that appoints a local superintendent, which is more like what we do now at the district level. So moving on to Horace Mann, let's take a moment to look at him as a person. And so he lived from May 4th, 1796 to August 2nd, 1859. They call him the father of the Common School. The Common School was a publicly supported school that started during the mid-1800s that was open to all students. So I say all students with quotes because I want to clarify that, of course, this excludes most blacks, and it excludes Native Americans, at least in this type of school. So really the biggest thing that made it more open was the fact that it was more open to poor students, but it's still not everybody. And then Mann was the most active leader in the Common School movement. He established the first State Board of Education, which we talked about, in Massachusetts, and he was its first secretary. So a lot of the reforms he fought for are listed here. So they resulted in the creation of training institutes for teachers, the creation of 50 new high schools and increase in attendance to those high schools, and an increase in funding for teacher salaries, books, and construction of school buildings. So it's really a big deal right now. I mean, there's hundreds of schools that are named after Horace Mann. So it's a really big deal in education. And then just a quote from Ian C. Friedman, the author of the book I suggested. Mann's educational philosophy influenced many other states and has had a profound impact on current mainstream thought. So again, I wanted to review the State Boards of Education, so just remember that they are the body that governs the State Department of Education. They're taking all the information that the State Department is gathering and monitoring and regulating, as well as information from their constituents, and advising the state legislature on laws that they should make. They also have a couple leadership roles that are specific to them, like standard setting, accreditation, teacher administration certification, implementation of state testing and assessment programs. So this is probably a lot more extensive than it was at the time that Horace Mann was the secretary of the State Board, but this is the position that we're talking about. Then we have the 1840s. The context in 1840, the first American patent for a camera issued to Alexander Woollcott. So again, some innovation in photography. And then we have William Henry Harrison as president in 1841. We have 4 presidents in this period. We also get John Tyler, James K. Polk, and Zachary Taylor. Samuel Morse sent his first successful long-distance telegraph from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Maryland in 1844. We gained Florida, Texas, Iowa, and Wisconsin in this decade. And we also have the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. And then finally, in education, we again have something from Horace Mann. So now that he is Secretary of the State Board of Education, he republishes annual reports, and in his 10th one, he asserted that education is the right of every child, and that it is the state's duty to provide that education. So, again, we said that the Constitution didn't provide for any sort of education regulation at the national level, but Horace Mann here is saying that he really believes it is the right of all students and that states should be the ones providing that. Then we have the 1850s. We get California. Milford Former is president. We have Elijah G. Otis, who invents the elevator. That's an interesting invention that decade. Franklin Pierce is the president from 53 to 57. We also have James Buchanan from 57 to 61. We get Minnesota. And in education, this is a big deal. The first compulsory school attendance law is approved by the Massachusetts legislature. We'll talk in a second about compulsory education. And then in the mid-1800s, this is sort of a side note, enrollment in private secondary academies reaches more than 250,000 students at more than 6,000 schools throughout the U.S. So this is sort of a side note. It's kind of a trend that's going on, and we'll see it when we get to the general statement about the 1800s, that private secondary academies became really popular right in the middle of the century, but near the end they declined in popularity because public high schools became more popular. So that's sort of died down. And then we'll go back to compulsory education. So let's take a moment to look at that. This is actually the title page from the law book from Massachusetts that includes the state law regarding compulsory education, the first one ever. So a couple of reasons this all comes from this education law book here. The reasons that compulsory education laws were passed originally, really early, it had to do with biblical religious reasons. People who couldn't read the Bible were considered vulnerable to satanic influence. So that was a reason to make everybody have to go to school. A democratic form of government could not survive without an educated citizenry. This was also a really common belief. So that's one reason to make everybody go to school. And then later in the late 19th century, which is after what we're talking about right now, a way to both promote democracy and to protect both children and adult jobs by limiting child labor. So this is later once we get the Industrial Revolution. And then now, today, we see compulsory education laws being supported by the idea that education is a prerequisite to productive participation in a modern economy. So those are some of the reasons. State laws that guide compulsory education usually include these ideas. One is ages when children are required to attend some form of education, types of education that qualify to satisfy the compulsory education law, ages of pupils and that the public schools must serve, length of the school year and school day and the minimum attendance requirements, basis for granting exceptions from compulsory education, and then provisions for the appointment of attendance officers who are specified with the authority to enforce these laws, and then finally provisions for criminal and non-criminal judicial proceedings and penalties to deal with violations of this law and excessive truancy. So in the 1860s, moving on, we have 1861, we get Kansas, and these are big years for us, of course, we're coming up to the Civil War. So Abraham Lincoln is president from 61 to 65, and in the same period, the American Civil War happens. In 1862, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. That picture was actually supposed to come up with the American Civil War. It's just a representation of that. But we get the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. In 1863, West Virginia becomes a state. Until 69, from that same period, we were building the Transcontinental Railroad, which is a huge innovation for the United States, really big in Western expansion, which we're going to talk about again at the end of the 18th century. Nevada becomes a state. The 13th Amendment is ratified in 1865, abolishing slavery. So with that comes the challenge of educating all of these blacks who have now been freed, especially in the South. Andrew Johnson is president from 65 to 69. Nebraska becomes a state in 67. And then Ulysses S. Grant is president from 69 to 87. And now in education, 1861. 28 of 34 states have established state boards of education and have chief state school officers whose responsibilities include distributing school funds and organizing the state's system of common schools. So we already talked about state boards, and we're going to talk now again about chief state school officers. We're just going to review that after we talk about this. In 1865, another sort of general trend, more than 50% of the nation's children are enrolled in public schools with the lowest rate of enrollment in the South. And of course, that's clear. That makes sense because the South has just gone through the Civil War, which was most detrimental to their economy and their government and their communities. So fewer children at that time are attending school in the South. Fewer children have always attended school in the South at this point because of differences in their view of education and its necessity and the differences in their economy. But right now, it has to do with the war. So again, state chief officer, so in Colorado it's called the commissioner, and again, he's appointed by the state board, he presides over the state Department of Education, he controls staff, agendas, information, and he is the secretary of the state board. So this is the role that they're talking about that is now provided for in most of the states that exist at this time. Then we move on to the 1870s. In 1876, we become a state here in Colorado. Alexander Graham Bell issues the first patent for the telephone. Rutherford B. Hayes, president from 77 to 81. Thomas Alva Edison introduced the phonograph. And then we've got a bunch of events, actually. The 1870s are super important for education. In 1870, the Massachusetts Congressman George Hoar's bill to establish federal school system in the South is defeated. So at this time, we see a lot of Reconstruction-era efforts to reconstruct the education in the South, but a lot of them failed. So this is one of the first ones that failed from George Hoar in Massachusetts. The National Education Association, the NEA, the teachers' union, was founded at this time, and they become very important through a lot of development in education reform in 1870. In 1873, the Maine legislature enacted the first law providing state aid for public high schools, also a really big deal. So public schools had existed already, but this is the first law on the books that says it's okay for the state to provide money for public high schools, which is going to set a trend for the rest of the states to follow. In 1874, the Michigan Supreme Court ruled in the Kalamazoo school case that the state legislature can tax for the support of both elementary and public schools. So again, this goes along with the Maine legislature's law, setting up a trend that it is okay to provide for public schools through taxes. And then in 1875, we have the sales of Noah Webster's Blue-Black Speller reached 75 million copies, making it the most influential book in U.S. schools. Remember, this book was first published back in the 1780s. So 1780 to the 1870s, and now it's reached its peak in sales. So that's almost 100 years that this book was used in school. Big deal. And remember, it sets up a nationalist perspective on English. And it also includes ideas about liberty and hard work and morality that are distinctively American. So then we have here the Blaine Amendment, which happened in 1875, and it sought to prohibit the use of state funds for sectarian schools or religious schools. It failed to pass. However, the people, I think it's Henry Blaine or Harry Blaine or something, who tried to pass the bill, went to several specific states individually, and those states, a lot of them, did come on board and illegalize funding for religious schools. So this is sort of the beginning of the debate of division of church and state in education. And then we have in 1876, the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson establishes the legal foundation for racial segregation in education. So this is separate but equal. This is what we all have heard of. So we're going to take a moment to look at the case, Plessy v. Ferguson. So this is a monument in Crescent City, Louisiana, where it just describes what happened. So Homer Adolph Plessy was removed from a train that was segregated and arrested, and he took the state to court and filed. It was the first case to post-Reconstruction to go against segregation based on the Equal Protection 14th Amendment in the Constitution, and it failed. However, it did set a lot of precedent. So, it happened in 1876. The court upheld a Louisiana statute requiring equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races on trains. So, even though it's just on trains, this case set up the separate but equal precedent for all areas. I mean, every public building, movie theaters, water fountains, we've all seen the pictures, and then also schools. The court rejected the claim that the Louisiana statute had stigmatizing effect on blacks and endorsed the legally enforced separation of the races as constitutionally permissible. It placed the burden of the proof on the plaintiff to show that it was without justification. However, it did find several social justifications for the law and rejected the plaintiff's claim of its harmful effects. So, however, it still was the first one to reject segregation, and later it became more important when we get Brown v. Board of Education. So now we're moving on to the 1880s. James Garfield is president in 1881. Then we have Chester Arthur from 1881 to 85, and Grover Cleveland from 85 to 89. Benjamin Harrison from 89 to 93. We get Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Washington. These are really western states, so we really are involved, once we have the Transcontinental Railroad, which we got in the 1860s, in western expansion. This is really happening. In 1882, in education, the New Hampshire Senator Henry Blair's bill that proposes $80 million for the states to use as they saw fit to fight illiteracy failed to pass. So we already looked at George Ford's bill back before, let's see, that was in the 1870s, and that one failed in terms of setting up schools, federal school system in the South. And this one is just trying to give them money to deal with illiteracy, which is going to happen for all states, but it was especially geared towards the South. But it's another one that failed to pass. So the South is still not getting any help. In the 1890s, we get the French brothers Auguste and Louis Lumière, who create the cinématographe, I can't speak French, which could record, develop, and project motion pictures. We get Idaho and Wyoming. Alexander Graham Bell makes the first long-distance call from Chicago to New York. Grover Cleveland is president again from 1893 to 97. William McKinley is president from 97 to 01. Utah becomes a state. And in education, 1890, rapid industrialization and increased immigration leads to the establishment of more than 2,500 high schools, whose enrollment doubles that of private academies. So the relationship between public high schools and industrialization is kind of complicated. We're going to talk about it again, but here's just sort of a trend of what's going on right now. The NEA in 1892 establishes the Committee of 10, which is a group of different people from the education industry. Ironically, it does not include any high school teachers. However, at this group committee meeting, they recommend uniform subject matter and instruction for all high school students. So they're basically setting up the first argument for standardization on a national level. The New York College for Training of Teachers, that are known as Teachers College, becomes part of Columbia University, so we're seeing again some emphasis on teacher preparation starting. And then we have in 1896, professor and philosopher John Dewey establishes the University of Chicago Laboratory School as a center of progressive educational practice, emphasizing learning through experience and the preparation of children for full participation in a democratic society. So what does it sound like? It sounds like that child-centered education that we saw from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And like I said about that one, this one also is going to lead into the progressive movement that we see later in education reform. So now we're getting to the final general summary of an era. We're looking at the 19th century school. And this is my last slide. This slide is going to suffice as both the summary for the 19th century and sort of my conclusion that we're leaving off here in part one. So here we go. There's a lot on this slide. It's going to be important. So in the 19th century, first of all, actually before I go into this bullet point, we have the idea of the advancement of the common man, which had to do with increased adherence to the notion of equality, and the idea that all should be able to read in order to participate in government and improve their standing in society. So this was sort of a philosophical idea that was popular in the 19th century that had to do with what was going on in education. One thing that happened during this era is the industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, which started even earlier in Europe but really took its hold in the 19th century in America. So a couple issues with this. Here we have child labor and immigration. Under child labor, we want to say in the beginning it caused fewer children to be going to school, obviously because they had jobs, so they weren't attending school during the day. However, later it also required training and often led to a need for affordable activities for children while their parents were working in the factories. So while child labor was a problem, it was keeping kids out of school, but later once they reformed that a little bit and some child labor laws got passed, they needed somewhere to put the kids while their parents were working in the factories, and they also needed to train people in order to be able to do those jobs. So that was a reason for schools to increase. We talked earlier about how public high schools increased during the same time. This is sort of why that's a little bit complicated. In addition, many reformers viewed education as a means of combating the negative effects of industrialization. So when kids got sent into the cities to do these jobs, we saw a spike in delinquency, we saw a spike in poverty. So in order to combat those things, some reformers believed education could handle that. We also see immigration. During the Industrial Revolution, a lot of reformers saw schools as a tool to Americanize these newcomers, who were often viewed as threatening to the native-born. And then another event that happens during this time, we have Western expansion. So in the Western frontier, we mostly see the one-room schoolhouses that are pretty famous. They were often the only public building in the community. And the people in these areas were more reluctant to allow for government influence on their education facilities, which later gave rise to a homeschool movement that we'll see when we get into History Part 2. The next thing we have on here is the Common School, which is a huge deal. We talked about this when we talked about Horace Mann. The Common School, however, although it's basically just a school that's publicly funded and open to all students, it varied by region. So in different regions, they would be different sizes, they would have different organizations, they would have different curricula. In most of these schools, there weren't grades, like first grade, second grade, third grade. Instead, you moved from one text to another, and that was how they measured progress. Like, if you could read this book, then you've succeeded. On the frontier, common schools still had to deal with a distrust of too much education. So in those areas, they really only focused on reading, writing, and arithmetic. You know, the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. Silly. In larger cities, however, they had a much broader curriculum. And then we have a little bit of reform. So in the late 19th century, or middle to late 19th century, we see a wider variety of textbooks. So we're getting away from just that blue backfeller and moving to more different textbooks which have different learning styles. So we see a switch from this rote learning memorization strategy to developing the individual talents of the students. So this is sort of, again, starting to move into the progressive area with the child-centered curriculum and the experiential learning, developing talents of individuals instead of just rote memorization. And then we have the establishment of state educational systems. So we talked about that a little bit already. But during the first half of the 19th century, states had gradually moved toward establishing education systems. However, state superintendents, which we saw when we talked about the very first one in New York, they were really just the educational chief officers, but they called them superintendents at that time. They had pretty weak powers. The legal requirements for collection of taxes and compulsory attendance were often ignored because parents, by tradition, still had the right to do whatever they wanted and not put their kids in school, along with churches having responsibility over children's education. So it wasn't necessarily, even though the laws said there were some compulsory education rules, it wasn't necessarily followed. We talked about Horace Mann a lot already, so I'm not going to go into that too much, but just remember he had to do with the common schools, he had to do with increasing funding, increasing popularity of schools, adding schools, and teacher training. We also have Henry Bernard, which I haven't talked about yet. He was a Connecticut state legislator. He later became the Secretary of State Board for Connecticut, and then also later Rhode Island. He was even later the U.S. Commissioner of Education, so he pretty much just moved up in status in the education field. He also espoused a democratic philosophy of education, as did Horace Mann and Thomas Jefferson. So that's the idea, again, that in order to have a good democratic nation, we need our citizens to be educated. And he was effective in spreading his message through the publication of the American Journal of Education. So that's sort of his contributions, but he was big in the 19th century, and I hadn't mentioned him yet. We have also the public high school. So in the first half of the 19th century, we see it appear. I have here growth, tax support, and standardization. So this is pretty complicated. Again, this is what I was mentioning when we talked about private schools, and I'm going to go into this. So we already talked about the 1821 English Classical School. That was the first public high school. At first, the public high schools grew in popularity really slowly. People didn't want to pay taxes for them, and private schools were really popular, like we talked about. So the idea of pre-secondary education, however, grew in popularity eventually, especially among the middle class, which was a newly growing group in America, and they viewed high school education as necessary to fulfill or to fully realize one's social and economic goals. So the middle class is starting to look at it as an economic reason for free and compulsory education, like we do now. The growth was also partly due to the Kalamazoo case that we talked about before, in which the legislator, I believe in Michigan, agreed that it's okay for the state to raise taxes for schools. So that was the reason that public high schools grew in popularity, because a couple states had regulated that was okay. There was a lack of standardization in public high schools, however. So we saw a lot of them appear, but then we realized they're not all doing the same thing, and they're not all preparing kids for college, and not all kids even want to go to college. So we had a couple things to deal with this. We already talked about how the NEA was founded in 1870. We also talked about how they created the Committee of 10 in 1892, and at that conference they set up a lot about standardization. So what they did was a couple things. They supported an increased focus on general education subjects such as Latin, English, math, physical and biological sciences, history, and geography. So these are really similar subjects to what we still study today in school. They supported the practice of studying each subject for one period each day, 5 days a week, for a year. So again, that's pretty much what we do now. They also supported the standard unit of credit for high school, which was called the Carnegie Unit. We still today have credits or credit hours that we use to monitor how much education kids are getting. So this is really the foundation of how schools are organized now. It's a big deal. They also supported an 8-year elementary school followed by a 4-year high school. So we still have the 4-year high school, but we split elementary into elementary and middle school. They also so in general, this meeting brought a sense of unification to the public high school on a national level. Later, we'll see in the 1900s, I think, that it was sort of opposed by a couple different people, and it still, today, is a huge argument about standardizing schools and standardizing tests and whether it's a good idea or whether we should allow for more innovation in schools. Big debate, and this is really the founding of it, with the public high school in the 19th century. Another thing that happened in the 19th century, moving on, we have normal schools, which were teacher preparation academies, and were named for the standard curriculum that they taught. So it was schools that were regulated, but they're actually for teachers. They started popping up in the 1840s, and they were a model for state-supported training of teachers. So big deal, very important, and it's still a big debate today also. A big characteristic of education in the 19th century is the exclusion of blacks and Native Americans. So I talked about that when I mentioned the common school that was supposed to be for all students but wasn't really. So even throughout the whole 19th century, even after slavery was abolished, education for blacks was limited in the North and almost non-existent in the South. For Native Americans, education for them had been guaranteed by numerous treaties that the U.S. government had signed with the various Native tribes, but it was usually done through substandard mission schools that just didn't provide the same education that white students were getting. It emphasized basic literacy and vocational and agricultural education, so just not the same sort of preparation that white students were getting. And finally, the dissatisfaction with this problem, especially with the Native Americans, has led into a lot of issues that we still see today, like issues with bilingual education, standards and assessment, and school choice. So if, for example, Native American children could choose to go to public schools outside of reservations or outside of their mission schools, they could probably have access to a better education, but we still have issues with that today. So that's sort of where this starts, is in the 19th century with this racial exclusion. And then we have the disruption of the Civil War in the 1860s. This obviously was especially bad in the South. Like I talked about, the 50% attendance national, but it was worse in the South, partly because of the war and partly because of their previous attitude towards education. A lot of Reconstruction-era efforts to educate the South and the newly freed blacks there mostly failed. We already talked about the George Hoare bill for a federal system of education in the South and the New Hampshire Blair bill for $80 million for combating illiteracy. Both those failed. So definitely still struggling in the South throughout the 19th century. We have vocational schools. So after the NEA proposed the standardization of high schools, a lot of people noticed that for kids that didn't want to go to college or had a trade that they wanted to go into, this system didn't really serve them. And there were also students who obviously couldn't go to college, and so it didn't serve them at all. So there were vocational schools that tried to fill the void of this standardization. In the late 19th century, there was also a need for skilled workers. So that was another reason that people started paying attention to vocational schools. There were some teacher training colleges that designed programs for vocational educators, and there was a teachers association, the Industrial Education Association, that was formed in 1884 to contribute to this movement. We also see the emergence of teacher prep frustration. So there was an increase in number in teacher colleges, but fewer than half the trained teachers needed for public schools were provided by normal schools or other teacher training. In reality, most teachers in real classrooms were still young women that were poorly educated and poorly paid. The Henry Bernard, who we mentioned before, who was the U.S. Commissioner of Education at the time that he did this, in 1867, made his proclamation that basically just expressed extreme frustration with the lack of teacher preparation. So I'll read that to you right now. The quote from it says, "Too many of those we have entrusted to guide and guard our nation's youth have little knowledge beyond that which they are attempting to impart. Indeed, we might well question whether their knowledge is superior to that of many of their fellow tradesmen. Not only is the depth and breadth of their knowledge of the curriculum matter a subject of concern, but where knowledge is possessed there exists most often an absence of any training in pedagogy. Teachers will not be elevated to that place in society and receive that compensation they so richly deserve until they are required to undertake a special course of study and training to qualify them for their new office." So he's expressing frustration with how poorly educated and trained the teachers were, and calling for a standard that would say that they couldn't teach until they were ready, and they couldn't afford a better salary until they were prepared to be good teachers. And I mean, I've attended meetings that are proposing bills to deal with this exact same problem today. Of course, now there are stricter requirements for becoming a teacher, but a lot of people still today feel that it's not strong enough. So these are enduring problems that all got started in the 19th century. Finally, we have private schools that we kind of talked about earlier. In this era, in the mid-1800s, they're becoming more established. However, their student body is becoming more and more composed of the wealthy, the people who want military training, and Catholics, who are often shunned from other public schools. We did talk already about the Blaine Amendment that sought to prohibit the use of state funds for sectarian schools, which failed to pass, but several individual states did ratify it. So again, we're seeing the beginning of the debate over separation of church and state, which later turns into issues of vouchers and scholarships that states are giving to kids to attend private schools, which are sometimes religious. So these are the big issues that we see in the 19th century that almost all of them continue to all the way to today in terms of debates about education reform. There's slightly different issues in this time, but really the ideas are really the foundation of education reform as we know it today. One more final summary and then we'll be done. We've got another trend or mindset in this time, and this is entirely a quote from the author of the book I recommended. "Well established was a de jure expression of belief in free opportunity for all citizens, and with that, all citizens, excluding blacks and Native Americans still, and with that came a dramatic increase in school enrollment and prominence in society. Also well established was the foundation for future arguments of education reform, including the role of government and religion in schools, teacher quality, and standards and curricula. So like I said, these are really the foundations of ed reform as we know it today. So with that, I'm going to leave you, and we will have another video on history next week that will go from the 20th century, starting in 1900, all the way up to 2000. And then after that, we'll do recent events, and we'll be done. So we're halfway there. Thank you for watching.